Welcome to the Lydia McGrew channel. Today I'm starting a new series. This series concerns apparitions as attempted explanations of the data that we have for Jesus' resurrection. I'm focusing on Dale Allison's book, The Resurrection of Jesus, Apologetics, Polemics, History. Allison comes to the conclusion eventually, somewhat tentatively, that the disciples experienced veridical but non-bodily appearances of Jesus. So Allison's position is normally called the objective vision theory. And he's a pretty standard proponent of the objective vision theory. But his idea is that they really didn't have experiences as robust as what is described in the Gospels. We'll be talking a lot about that. But at the same time, he kind of does a two-pronged approach. He does argue that there are significant parallels, as he calls them, in a chapter called Thinking with Parallels, between what is actually recorded in the Gospels and what he finds in the apparition literature. I'll be mentioning from time to time that I think he's way too uncritical about the apparition literature. He never seems to consider the possibility that people are really just lying or take it with any seriousness at all, even though the majority of the people who claim to have seen apparitions don't suffer anything significant and have no reason to expect to suffer anything significant. And I'll be mentioning that from time to time. Interestingly, he usually takes the accounts in the apparition literature as just being what the people really experienced, but he is willing from time to time to take the accounts in the Gospels as not being what anybody really experienced. Somebody just made up parts of it, put it in there later, and it wasn't what somebody experienced. So he kind of does this back and forth move, and we'll really see this. At the beginning of the chapter, on Thinking with Parallels, he says he wants to compare like with like and almost like. That's hyphenated, almost like, in order to enlarge understanding. Now, one of his alleged parallels is rainbow body literature, in which supposedly some Buddhist gurus' bodies just disappear and they supposedly turn into rainbows. I did a series of a couple of long videos on rainbow bodies a few years ago and showed that from an evidential point of view, they are definitely not almost like the evidence for the resurrection. So this series is going to be on grief hallucinations. Other names are sometimes given for them: grief apparitions, sometimes bereavement hallucinations, bereavement apparitions. So there's a variety of names, but all describing this, and argue that even as reported, those are not almost like. Now, I haven't re-reviewed the apparition literature that Dale Allison cites. And so, I'm not going to be giving you a blow-by-blow, I think that person probably just lied and so forth. That's not really the way I'm going to approach this. Instead, I'm going to be using Allison's own admissions and his bait and switch tactic. So at times, he will try to say that the phenomenology of apparitions as found in the apparition literature provides a significant analogy to what is found in the gospel stories. I want to say this again and again. If you're a skeptic or an Allison fan or both, and you watch this video, I'm going to probably be able to hear you all the way across the country from where I am saying, well, I don't think that's what they really experienced. I just think that's made up. Yes. We know that, okay? But what I'm pointing out is that Allison is engaging in a bait and switch because he will start out, sometimes very explicitly, sometimes by insinuation or implication, implying or stating that what we find in the apparition literature actually fits really well with what we find in the actual gospel stories. And I mean, if you're going to say that, then you need to be prepared to back it up. And then if you realize that that's not true, you have to be prepared to say, oh yeah, I was wrong, okay? And before your book goes to press, go back and correct your overstatements. Because at other times he'll switch, and then he'll say that what's found in the Gospels, which he admits is blatantly disanalogous to the apparition literature, that was probably added later, that probably isn't what they experienced anyway. But the initial claim is that this is similar to the gospel stories themselves. And then, when he can't maintain that, he'll retrench and say, well, those are probably made up, so that doesn't count as part of the data. It's like, well, then you shouldn't have, either implied or stated in the first place that the apparition literature has a significant analogy to what's actually in the gospel stories. All right, my example today, which is a pretty blatant one of this phenomenon in Allison, concerns how long Jesus speaks. Again, I'm talking about the gospel stories themselves because Allison tries to say that how long Jesus speaks in the gospel stories bears a significant analogy to how long apparitions speak typically, and how short it's going to emerge in the apparition literature. On pages 216 and following, Allison lists a large number of alleged parallels between the apparition literature and Jesus' appearances as found in the Gospels. Now, one of these alleged parallels is speaks very briefly, often only a sentence or two. So that's alleged to be an important similarity. So he'll say, oh yes, I admit there are differences. But on this point, he's claiming it's a similarity to what we find in the Gospels. And this claim that this is a similarity will surprise those of us who are familiar with Luke's and John's Gospel accounts. In Luke 24, it explicitly says that Jesus carried on a long conversation with the two on the Emmaus Road, teaching them about how he fulfilled prophecies from the Old Testament. That same chapter later on talks about his giving a similar teaching to the 11 and those who are with them, and that also is supposed to include those who were on the Emmaus Road, so they got to listen to that sermon twice. In John 21, Jesus is with the disciples all through breakfast, and I'm going to be coming back to that even today. And in a later video, I'm going to be talking about eating as a dissimilarity admitted by Allison with the apparition literature. He has a dialogue with Peter after breakfast, apparently while others are present. And then he's walking with Peter and the beloved disciple when they discuss the fate of Peter, the later fate of Peter and the beloved disciple. And then there's a dialogue with the disciples in Acts 1 about the establishment of the kingdom, whether he's going to establish the kingdom. Now, all of these are definitely not parallels with speaks very briefly, often only a sentence or two. They're definitely more than a sentence or two. Not even close. An explicit statement that he opened to them the scriptures and showed them how the Messiah must suffer and so forth. Sorry, you're not going to do that in a sentence or two. And once again, it's Allison who's trying to say that this fits. In fact, this is not even just an insinuation, as some of the later ones are. This is explicit. There's footnote 40, to that, speaks very briefly, often only a sentence or two. Footnote 40. This fits the New Testament stories. Only in later Christian sources, presumably here it means later than the New Testament stories, does the resurrected Jesus deliver long discourses. Even though the canonical Gospels put extended speeches into Jesus' mouth, they do not do this in their resurrection narratives. Now, I imagine that a retrench here will be, well, all he's saying is that it doesn't spell out that discourse about prophecy and so forth. All Allison is saying is that Luke doesn't give that speech. Well, that can't be all he's saying. I mean, it's true, Luke doesn't spell out that speech, only their topic. But remember, in the main text, the alleged parallel with the Gospels is speaks very briefly, often only a sentence or two. Okay, so it's supposed to be a parallel that Jesus only speaks briefly and only speaks no more than a sentence or two, and that this, quote, fits the New Testament stories, then I'm sorry, that's falsified even by propositional assertions in those stories that are completely incompatible with it, even if they don't spell it out. If you're going to say this fits with the New Testament stories, and the New Testament stories say, by the way, he gave them this really long, detailed discourse on the Old Testament, then it doesn't fit with the New Testament stories. This is straightforward. Now, Allison sort of kind of suddenly admits this, and here's the bait and switch, and tries to explain it away. Only in Luke 24:36-49 and John 21:15-23 do we get more than 2 or 3 sentences, and both passages in their present forms are late. The latter deals with the crisis occasioned by the beloved disciples' death, and the former is full of Lucan redactional traits, unquote. So, he's now admitting that the statement that speaking only very briefly fits the New Testament stories is false, even though he just said it. Now he's kind of taking it back without saying, I was wrong. But then he's sort of trying to wriggle out of that by saying, implying that he has some objective way of telling that these were added later. Now, to put it mildly, he has no such objective, non-question begging means of telling. Allison's judgments, like those of so many critical scholars on such passages, are a combination of bare assertion, like that bare assertion about the beloved disciples' death and what occasioned John 21, and question begging. For example, in the Emmaus Road case, he expressly casts doubt on the historicity of the Emmaus Road story because, among other things, it is, quote, congenial to Christian reflection and apologetics. All right? He also says that when Jesus appears to the 12 in Luke and asks for fish, this is the appearance that right after that it says whether it's meaning on that occasion or not. It comes right in that same passage that he opened the scriptures to them, that it is expanded for apologetical purposes, perhaps to counter docetism or the idea that Jesus was a hallucination or a ghost. All right, now that's a very common view, but there's something very circular about it, because what you're saying is the reason you're going to claim that this stuff is late and is made up is because it would support the idea that Jesus was really literally bodily present, not just in a vision, not just a ghost. And since it counters that, since it's incompatible with that theory, it was probably made up and put in there later. And then you're going to say, and guess what? The apparition literature, where the person speaks very briefly, often merely a sentence or two, fits with the gospel stories, or the parts of the gospel stories that I didn't cut out, and I cut those out because they don't fit with this theory. Okay, you can't do that. That's completely epistemologically illicit. Okay. And in fact, he talks about these being Lucan stories in the case of Luke, so he doesn't even have an earlier version of the story as told by, the storyteller. That doesn't include Jesus opening the scriptures to them and so forth. The story is the story. All right. So this is just really circular. This fits with the story in the Gospels. Well, this part in the stories in the Gospels doesn't fit with this description that he speaks only briefly. Oh, well, that was probably added later. How do we know it was probably added later? Well, because it would support the idea that Jesus was really bodily present, really physically present, and so therefore it was added later to support that. All right. So this really doesn't show that the apparition literature enlarges our understanding, as he said at the beginning. Now I'm going to give a really humorous example of his attempt to claim that Jesus speaks only very briefly in the gospel stories. He has a list in footnote 40, which you're welcome to look up, of a bunch of references and kind of a blatant argument from silence. For example, in John 20, it tells about the first meeting between Jesus and 10 disciples, and it's told pretty briefly, so we only have a couple of sentences there, but that is not an assertion that Jesus only gave a couple of sentences on that occasion. It only reports a couple of sentences isn't the same as it reports that he only said a couple of sentences. But I'm going for bigger game here. The most amusing example in that list is John 21, 9 through 12. Now remember, later in that same footnote, he's going to retrench and say that that whole story is made up. All right. But at this point, he's trying to have it both ways. He's trying to list, for whatever reason, John 21, 9 through 12, as if it somehow confirms the claim that Jesus speaks only very briefly in the stories in the Gospels. I'm going to read you John 21, 9 through 12 from the ESV. When they got out on land, they saw a charcoal fire in place with fish laid out on it and bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you have just caught." So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore full of large fish, 153 of them. And although there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Now none of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. So here are verses that by their own content are completely embedded in a context implying a long, bodily, not even remotely apparitional group appearance in which Jesus has already lit a fire, or he has a fire lit. He has some food already there. He invites them to breakfast, after which he's going to have a dialogue with Peter, because it says after breakfast, he said to Peter, "Do you love me?" But Allison lists these verses as illustrating a parallel concerning speaking only very briefly with the apparition literature. The only possible excuse he can have for that, for listing these verses, is that in just those few verses that are plucked out of the, larger story in which they're embedded, the only sentences attributed to Jesus are, "Bring some of the fish that you have just caught and come and have breakfast." Oh, look, that's 2 sentences. That's only 2 sentences. So, bring some of the fish that you've caught, come and have breakfast. I clipped out a few verses that contain only 2 sentences by Jesus, and I clipped them out from a longer passage in which Jesus said more, but now I'm going to say, look, these 2 verses that I clipped out only contain 2 sentences, so that confirms a parallel with the apparition literature in which an apparition speaks only very briefly. This is crazy. And let's also ignore the content of even those 2 sentences, which are telling them to bring fish and come and eat with him, come and have breakfast, which imply, just in that content right there, a much longer interaction, which does not fit with the apparitional literature. That is just an astounding argumentative move. And it just, goes by because he's got this list of references, and I looked them up, and I'm like, you're kidding me. You're taking John 21, 9 through 12 as part of a list that supposedly supports the claim that this fits with what we find in the gospel stories. Now, I'm going to make use of this admission by Allison that the apparition literature shows them speaking often only very briefly. Only very briefly. I'm going to make use of that to show that the apparition theory, even if there were such things, I have some doubts, but as these grief apparitions, bereavement apparitions, doesn't fit well with the data in the Gospels. Now, I know, of course, that the very next move is going to be, well, that was all made up anyway. Okay, I know, not okay, but I know that, of course, that's what skeptics are going to say, and that's even what Allison is going to say. But if this was what the disciples claimed happened to them, including Jesus opening the scriptures and teaching them about Old Testament prophecy and so forth, then they had a grief hallucination, they had a bereavement apparition, is not a good explanation of them claiming that. Not a good explanation of that claim. By Allison's own admission, that in the apparition literature, usually the apparition speaks only very briefly. So that is a bigger admission than he wants to admit, and he tries to somehow massage the data and turn it around into a confirmation of the parallel, but it's actually a pretty big disconfirmation of the alleged parallel. All right, next time we're going to talk about a different admission concerning what happens many times in the apparition literature, different admission by Allison. I won't tell you what that is right now. That's going to be a briefer video anyway. But I hope you'll enjoy this theory, because this series, this is just the beginning of debunking the claim that grief apparitions provide a good explanation of the data that we have, or even that there are significant parallels between grief apparitions and what the disciples supposedly experienced. And that's important. It's important because you get a lot of gesturing to grief apparitions, grief hallucinations, bereavement visions in the skeptic literature. It's quite a big go-to for them. And so I really want to emphasize that it doesn't fit. So I hope you'll come back next time to the Lydia Mugru channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.